are going to be starting our last segment of the day here with Spike Cohen, who has already been introduced to you. I'd like to ask again, if you have not yet registered for the event, just to do that, to count towards our attendance, just so that we know all who's here, and can show our sponsors that we're putting on a great event. So this discussion is going to be more on free speech absolutism and talking about hate speech, things like that, and then we're going to try to save a lot of time for Q&A with Spike for the second part. So first question, why is free speech valuable, and where does our right to freedom of speech come from? Like, is it from God? Is there another way to justify it? Is it from people's own rationality?
I'll start with the second part first. So I'm going to give the most, religiously or lack thereof, ecumenical version of my idea behind, the construct or the thinking I use about where our right to free speech comes from, and it's that it comes from where all of your rights come from, which is starting at the very moment that you began to exist, you were endowed with certain rights that come from concepts like self-ownership and personal autonomy. One of those is the right to speak and think freely, meaning that you have a right to speak and say as you wish and not be aggressed upon for it by government or by another person. The government can punish you for it. The person shouldn't be able to assault you for it. You can certainly be challenged for it, or someone can choose to disassociate from you for it, or to argue with you or call you a bad name. That's their freedom of speech and association. But that's where that comes from, is that you have an inherent pre-existing right. There are some who believe that it is a useful right that is granted by the government to allow us to have a society in which people can share different ideas and we don't get married into a increasingly worsening orthodoxy of some kind. It allows us to challenge our pre-existing beliefs and things like that. But I tend to think of a model in which we have this right because we are individual human beings. How is it? Was it useful or helpful? Was the question?
Why is it valuable?
I think it's valuable because imagine the alternative. Imagine where you could never truly say what you thought about something to anyone. Maybe you're experiencing that here in education, or when you were in college, maybe you were experiencing that. What was that like? Besides what was it like for you personally, what does that do to your community and to, I guess, our greater civilization or to our country? It's not good. When what can be said is being centrally planned by a relative handful of that public, that's a huge problem. You know, all of the worst things that have ever happened started with a handful of people controlling what could be said and done, and they just so happen to say that you all have to agree with them, or there's going to be some major consequences for it. So I think if you're not free to express yourself and to speak and to say as you wish and to think as you wish, to express what you think as you wish, then that's a very dark society that I don't think any of us would want to live in.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can all see the value in people expressing their opinions, but specific examples, like where's the value in people saying things that are patently false or totally bigoted? Like, where does the value there come from?
Right, so first of all, it's who's deciding that it's patently false? I certainly wouldn't want the government deciding that. I mean, increasingly, a conspiracy theory is something that will be proven correct within the next 6 to 12 weeks. And also with the question of bigoted, we may have more consensus on what we consider bigoted, and maybe there'll be some disagreement on the margins, but there is going to be some disagreement on the margins. But even if we know that something is patently untrue, or that something is bigoted against others, or bigoted against another idea or another type of person, if freedom of speech doesn't protect the most egregious forms of speech, then it doesn't actually protect freedom. It protects acceptable consensus speech. And all you got to do is tighten that consensus or tighten that window of what's acceptable, and suddenly your speech is on the margins. Everyone here probably has at least one opinion that you may decide to be careful in sharing with others before you know more about them. But you shouldn't be punished for it. The fact that you have that opinion, you shouldn't be punished for it. You shouldn't be punished for thinking that or expressing it to someone else. Again, they can choose to disassociate from you if they think that it's bad. But if freedom of speech is reserved for things that we have a consensus that it's acceptable, that's not freedom of speech. That's all of us just deciding to think the same thing. And that's going to narrow and narrow. The mission creep's going to set in, and that acceptability is going to narrow in until one day your opinion or your what you have to contribute to it is going to be considered bigoted or false.
How would you respond to people who say that hateful speech does real harm to people, in the way that, like, I know lots of people who say that they would rather, like, take a slap on the face than some really hurtful comment that, like, they remember years later? Doesn't that do real harm to people? Shouldn't that be regulated just as other kinds of harm?
This is where my stoicism is going to come in. We cannot control what others do to us. We can control how we respond to it. That was something that I learned way too late in life, but it has served me very well. If someone tries to actually physically harm you, then obviously you can defend yourself. You can make sure that they're punished for that and so forth, because you can't control the effect that they're having on you in an actual physical way. If someone says something to you and you experience harm from it, that is a choice that you have made. Now, it's easy for me to say that up here, or it may seem like it's easy for me to say that up here. You may have heard some things, especially if they're from someone that actually their opinion mattered to you, that hurt you very deeply to your core, but it's still true. When I was a young, younger than even many of you, and the internet first came out, and I'm on AOL chat rooms, and I first experienced, people talking about gassing the Jews because my last name was Cohen. I chose what that meant to me and what that made me feel like. Because they weren't proposing an actual policy. There wasn't I wouldn't say an actual serious incitation of violence, and certainly not a credible threat. There was people being stupid on the internet because they could actually talk to people anonymously for the first time ever. I got to choose how I responded to that and how that made me feel. I learned very quickly that it's just random comments on the internet. I could have chosen to internalize that and say, these are the kinds of things that have been said that then may have been a precursor to it actually happening, and that could affect me. But again, this is me having a conversation in my head, as opposed to just, this person said this, that's how I react. And the potential that someone can choose to feel harmed by the words of others is not a good reason to allow there to be a central planning of what can and cannot be said. Far more people will be harmed in actual, real physical harm and in elimination of the freedoms and punishment by allowing that to happen.
Yeah. What about speech that inhibits others from speaking, or people who claim that, for example, sexist speech would exacerbate sexism and then reduce women's ability to voice their opinions and be heard? Is this not a legitimate concern?
That is, for example, if I were to say something sexist, that it would then inhibit a woman or a feminist's ability to speak?
Yeah, like if we let sexism proliferate through not censoring it at all or doing anything about it, that the conditions that would create would limit women's ability to speak, for example.
So what we want to stop is the conditions it could create, right? Like, if I say, I'll give an example. By the way, I don't think this. But if I were to say, for example, I believe that every single woman should only be wherever the male head of her household should allow her to be, whether it's her father or grandfather or male guardian or her husband or older brother. I believe that it should always be the case. That in and of itself did not limit your ability to say, hey, you're a jerk, I don't ever want to see you again. Or I agree with you, or I think that was the dumbest thing I heard today, or say nothing and walk away, whatever you choose to do. I didn't limit your speech. Now, if I start advocating for policies that require you for women to have to live that way, well, now that is actual harmful. But that's completely different than my expressing the opinion about it. So what you fight is the attempt to actually try to limit your freedoms but not for me to advocate for that. Because the slippery slope there, we could then say, well, that means that we shouldn't allow people to be conservative, or progressive, or socialist, or whatever. We couldn't allow them to have these policies, because technically many of those have authoritarian elements to them that limit others if they were implemented. So that's what you fight, is implementation of someone's opinion becoming a policy that affects you, not them expressing that opinion.
So it sounds to me like your support of free speech and keeping government out of regulating free speech comes from two places, both a principled place of human rights and a self-ownership, like you said, but also a practical place of what could happen if government tried to regulate speech.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit more and how you weigh both of those? If they were in contrast, would one outweigh the other?
I have tried to tightly tailor my personal, I guess, ideology or belief system so that my perception of what the consequences would be are in perfect alignment with the principle behind it, if that makes sense. Like, I don't really have any beliefs where I go, well, yeah, if this really ever was fully implemented to its logical conclusion, it would be terrible, but, my principles mean that I have to believe in this thing, or vice versa, that this completely goes against my principles, but I think it's really the only functional way that it could ever work. I really think that, and this has been a long time coming, I think, and this is an example of that, I think that trying to, and I know you're not doing this, but trying to say, well, is this something that you're doing as based on your principle or on the fact that you think it would work best? I think that's a false binary. Part of my principle is that I think it would work best.
Thanks. Apart from questions of government regulation, what do you think about so-called cancel culture? We talked about this a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So you believe probably in freedom of association, and to what extent should we dissociate from people who have opinions different from us, or from people's opinions? Like, where do you draw the line between someone freely dissociating and someone locking himself in an echo chamber or something?
I believe every single one of you needs to make that decision for yourself. And I'm not trying to skirt the question. I truly believe that you are better equipped to decide what you would are comfortable exposing yourself to versus staying away from, or what you are comfortable challenging versus agreeing with versus just disassociating from, so you don't have to hear it. That's entirely up to you, and it's a very, very personal decision. I will say, broadly speaking, I personally try to expose myself to as many different ideas as possible, and it has largely served me very well. I will also say that, in general, I am a big fan of allowing and seeing as much as I can, because I personally think if I'm trying to protect myself from ideas that I think are dangerous, then I'm actually doing myself harm, because I might be missing a proliferation of something that could actually be very dangerous to me. And because I'm saying, I don't know, look at that, that's bad stuff over there, that I could be missing out on something happening that could rise up and actually be a threat. And so I think it would be much better when I'm seeing those things to know what their arguments are, to know where it is they're coming from, to know both the archetypes of the type of people and the conditions by which they end up associating with those types of things, so I can best challenge them. The more dangerous they are to me, the more important it is, in my mind, to know how to combat it best. So I am actually a big fan of challenging things as much as possible. As it comes to what is cancel culture and what is good or bad about it, cancel culture, as I define it, it's typically on the left, but honestly, that's not even the best way to define it. I define it as a type of social shaming that has no expiration date. It could be something that you said when you were a child and it was recorded, or something that you said 50 years ago when you were a young adult, or had a completely different set of opinions. And also, so that's one component of it. It has to be something that has no expiration, and also it has no potential for learning your lesson and salvation. You are required to prostrate yourselves and to say, this was terrible, I am so sorry I said this. I am now learning from my mistakes. You're still bad. and you will always be bad, and you will always be judged against that thing, and always to your detriment. And you can never be involved in, if you were a professor, you can never be a professor again. If you ran a certain type of company or were involved in a certain type of profession, you can never do so again. It's best that you probably change your name and maybe move to a different country or a different part of the country, because it's just, you've done a terrible thing. It's like original sin, but without the part where you can repent and get salvation from it. That is how I define cancel culture versus just social shaming, which I frankly think that, this is me sounding like an old curmudgeon again, but I actually think that social shaming is how we got civilization. Because we shamed away the people that said, let's just loot others. We shamed away the people that said, I'm going to bed any woman I want, and I won't be responsible for the children it creates. We socially shamed people who said, I'm never going to do anything. You take care of it. You give it to me, and if you don't give it to me, there's going to be trouble. We socially shamed antisocial people because we had to, or our family, village, community, country would die. And so I think we are often removed from that because we're in an increasingly post-scarcity society where you can literally act antisocial your entire life and be all right. And while it's great that we're in that kind of situation where we have that luxury, I do think it's okay for us to say there are certain behaviors that are conducive to civilization and conducive to our own personal betterment, and to encourage it. And if someone chooses not to do it, that's fine. We can say, wow, that guy's an idiot, and move on, or we can tell them they're an idiot, or we can try to correct them, but that is their choice to make. So I'm a fan of freedom of association and dissociation, to a degree that some people here may not even agree, and that's fine. You may choose to ironically disassociate from me for it, but I think the difference with cancel culture is that literally something that I posted in some web group in 2003 when I was a neocon, someone would try to cancel me for that 21 years later and tell me there's nothing I can do to make up for it. I'm just bad for everyone.
Got it. So for our last question before we turn it over to the audience.
Sure.
In the places where the government does regulate speech, such as like slander, those kind of cases, is it because of the speech itself, or is it based on consequences? And then couldn't you say that if your speech has bad consequences for someone, it shouldn't be allowed?
Yeah, so I think, and this is where you start to get into the margins. So I would say, when you get into, and I'll give some other examples first, then we'll get to that. If you are making a clear and serious and credible threat to harm someone else, that is not free speech. That is you threatening someone. And so I think that should be treated that way. If you are inciting violence, and this is where there's a lot of margin there, a lot of gray space there between advocating for a policy and calling for incitation of harm. I think, and Peter had mentioned this earlier, that, for example, if there are people saying some horrific incitation of violence, that, he could see where, for example, a university would say, you can't say that. But you couldn't be arrested for it. You couldn't go to jail or be fined for it. But that brings us to like fraud and defamation. If I lie to you with the express purpose of trying to take something from you, I am robbing you. That's an act of aggression. I'm robbing you with my words, and there's also a bit of margin there between, am I telling you something that I believe to be true, or am I giving you the most sunny outlook, or am I straight up lying to you? And that's why we have arbitration for that. That's why we have civil suits for that, and that's why we have criminal prosecution with due process for that, because there's not a strict line there. But if you have truly crossed the line into telling someone something that you know is not true for the express purpose of taking money from them, you've robbed them. You've just robbed them, with your brain and your words, and not with your threat of force or by pickpocketing them or something like that. You mentioned slander. Now let me get to your actual question, which is defamation. I actually believe that, broadly speaking, we over-enforce that. I think we should allow a lot more people saying mean things about each other. I do think if you get into a point where you are lying about someone who is not a public official, they're open game. But if you cyberbully the government, but if you get into lying about someone and you know it to be true, and you're doing so that you can harm their livelihood and or social standing, I'd obviously not be criminally prosecuted, but there is a case to be made that you at least owe them something in like civil arbitration, in like a civil suit or something like that. Those are the margins of that, and because it's why we have courts and not just some programmatic look at the piece of paper and say they did this, because there is some disagreement there on where that line gets crossed from simply bad-mouthing someone and defaming them, or simply giving a really sunny outlook on your new company you want people to invest in versus straight up defrauding them.
Correct. Thanks. Any questions from the audience perspective? Yes.
You recently said that there's a difference between inciting violence and stating your own opinion. Can you give an example of the sexist opinion, right? For example, let's say a woman should always be accompanied by a male.
Yeah.
In that case, we deprive women of their freedom. In that case, isn't it also an act of violence, making it incitation of violence?
Not if I'm giving my opinion and saying I believe that should be the case, then no, I'm not inciting violence, I'm simply giving my opinion on that. If I get into office on the promise of making this a law, and then I'm advocating turning it into a law, or if I say and start setting up an actual organization built around getting men to rise up and force their women to live by this, and am actively calling for men to harm women if they don't listen to them, then that's when you start to cross the line into incitation of violence. But if I'm just saying, I think that the societies or the countries or cultures in which women are treated like property or cattle, or treated certainly at a lower status as men, that those are good. That's me giving my opinion on that. It in and of itself is not violence. And if we are to say that's violence, then you could just as easily argue that so many other beliefs about how things ought to go could be called violence. It could, anytime someone says there ought to be a law that someone shouldn't be allowed to do that, well, that technically, if using that, the logic you're using, or the logic you've proposed, could be an incitation of violence. You're calling for people to be caged and robbed for doing something that right now is perfectly legal. So that's where you got to be careful of the slippery slope of saying this is because if what you said actually happened and was proposed, it would be violating people's rights. That in and of itself is violence or an incitation of violence.
Okay, I'm going to go to the first question about where do you derive the free speech right? So as I understood, it mainly it's all about self-ownership or national rights arguments. But if you're following the national rights arguments, how would you dispute as some people who would have positive national rights arguments, who would say that yes, national rights exist, but then we also have positive right to healthcare, positive right to something else, with non-libertarians.
Stuff that isn't right, yeah. No, and that's a good, no, but it's churlish for me to say that, because you're right, people can turn right around and go, well, I have a right to food. And the easiest answer to that is what you're calling healthcare, food, housing, whatever. If it requires the service of someone else, it's not a right, it's a service. It's still a need, but it's not a right. It would be like asking someone, do we have a human right to sex? And I bet there's a handful of people that might say that before they consider the implications of that. Because, no, we definitely don't, and you definitely need to consider the implications of that before saying it. So yeah, I would say the same thing when it comes to with healthcare or food or any of those things. Those are services. Someone else has to do something, which means you're either, in order to say this is a right of mine, which means that I'm supposed to receive it just because I exist, right? Then you're either saying that someone has to provide this to me for free, or someone needs to be robbed to pay for the provision of it to me, or some combination of those things. I could get much more deep and then ignore everyone else that has questions and get into where my idea of how I derive my idea of us having individual natural rights comes from, which would already answer that question as to why it's not a right. But that's the easiest way to do it without going into a 30-minute discussion about self-ownership or property rights. If someone else has to actually provide it to you, then it's not a right, it's a service.
So in 2020, you were the Vice Presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party. And then 4 years later, we now have a changing of the guard. People who are running the party are different now. And we're coming up to this big impasse where they're going to have to decide who's going to be the presidential candidate. And there have been stirrings that RFK Jr. would be a potential candidate for the Libertarian Party. So my question is, it's a two-part question. The first part is, what is your opinion about the Libertarian Party potentially doing something like that? And second, would you ever consider running for president?
I'll answer the second one first. I don't want to run for president. I mean, I won't, but I don't want to. And so what I've said a few times is if at some point I'm running, I announce that I'm running for president, check to see if I'm blinking twice or if I'm doing something weird, because I may have been taken hostage. But I may end up, I'd rather not. But that doesn't, I've done things before that I'd rather not do. Which brings us to the second question. Bobby has been a very welcome voice recently on issues of medical freedom, of freedom of speech, of many things that libertarians hold dear. He also has a very large platform. He has a name that comes with an incredible amount of frankly, undue deference, and he has a lot of media attention. There are a lot of understandable reasons why people are considering Bobby for our nomination. In 2020, early 2020, when libertarians were railing against the lockdowns, Bobby was talking about how they not only were good, but that they should be continued because they're good for the environment. Which not only means that he was at least initially pro-lockdown, but that's the justification for climate lockdowns, which are likely to be something that will be not trivially considered in the future. Bobby has called gun rights groups terrorist organizations. Even now when he talks about guns, he'll say things like, well, we're not looking at getting rid of guns for now. That's a hell of a qualifier. He has called for, in the past, people who deny climate change to suffer prosecution for it. I'll speak more to the point, because you can get into the gotcha quotes and all of that. At the California convention earlier this year, Bobby gave a speech in which he said, among other things, that one of the signs of civilizational decline is when government begins to privatize property. Privatization and decentralization is one of the cores of libertarianism. I don't parse my words when I say this, and I want to preface by saying that I'm glad Bobby is running. I'm glad that he is putting his voice behind this, and I will fight for Bobby as an independent or other party candidate to get on as many state ballots as he can, because I think the American voters should have as many choices as possible. We are a nation of 350 million people. The idea that we have 2 or 3 or 4 choices to choose from is patently absurd, and I think it's good that he is there. Bobby Kennedy is openly hostile to some of the core ideas behind libertarianism. Now that brings us back to the party. If the party is willing to abandon libertarianism for 5% of the vote, or for ballot access, or to get on the debate stage, then what do you suppose we'd be willing to sacrifice to win? A libertarian party that abandons libertarianism is not just worse than what we seek to replace because we're using the libertarian brand when we act just like what we're trying to replace. Actually worse, because they usually hold out for a win before they completely sell out. But it would also be an active sucking mechanism from the liberty movement, taking good money and good activism time and putting it into an effort to sully the name of libertarianism by making the most well-known bannerman of libertarianism in American history someone who is openly hostile to our beliefs. You thought Gary Johnson saying bake the cake was a problem? Or asking what Aleppo is? A Libertarian Party that chose to abandon libertarianism in exchange for an easier path to ballot access is a waste of every penny and every second that continues to be spent on it. It will be one of the biggest threats to the liberty movement, at least in America, and it should cease to exist. Any other questions? And again, I say that as, I am not saying Bobby Kennedy bad, Bobby Kennedy shouldn't run. I am saying Bobby Kennedy is not a libertarian, he's openly hostile to some of our ideas, he should not be our candidate. And not going much further, I'll make sure he isn't. Any other questions?
I've got one.
Sure.
With your organization, You Are the Power, helping people from local governments, I've seen a little bit, I'm not remembering exactly, about local governments where people have been like not allowed to voice their opinions to their government at meetings. Like, what kind of free speech issues do you deal with?
So we have a lot of free speech issues to deal with. So without going into a whole thing, You Are the Power, my nonprofit, we find people who are being abused by their local governments. We organize our community of thousands of activists and the general public to fight for those folks who are being abused. And we fight for them to get the justice and respect that they should have gotten from the beginning, and we don't stop until we win, and we do win. In this case, we have had issues where people will show up to city council meetings, town council meetings, school board meetings, and be told you're not allowed to speak, or we're not going to let you say certain things. You can't say anything about us by any of the council members by name. You can't make a bad faith accusation that what we're doing is bad or that we're doing it for the wrong reasons. Basically, we're going to openly infringe upon your First Amendment affirmed right to petition government for redress of grievances. And it is, we think of censorship, and we understandably and correctly think of things like the Patriot Act, and we think of things like the Alien and Sedition Acts and things like that. We think of Twitter files and Facebook files and the government using social media and big tech to censor us. We often don't think about, right in our own backyard, the city council not letting you ask them a question. But that's actually more likely to acutely affect you on a day-to-day basis, especially in your own backyard, because they are also the ones who typically control your police department. And so, yeah, no, they can things can go from 0 to 100 really quickly with them because they're right in your backyard. There's no bureaucracy involved. It's a person telling a person to arrest you because they didn't like what you said. So it is a problem. We have fought it. We also fight a lot of people blocking other people, public officials blocking their constituents on social media for saying, hey, I think you're doing a bad job, or even just asking them a question. And also very illegal, according to the First Amendment and multiple court decisions, including a very recent one whose name escapes me at the moment, that flat out said if you're a public official, you cannot block, even on your personal account. If you ever reference your job on your personal account, you are operating that as a public official, and in no way can you infringe upon your constituents' rights to petition redress of grievances, including on the digital public square. And so we do a lot of, I like to call it cyberbullying. Some people say that sounds aggressive, but they started it. We let them know what we think about that. And so if you want to be a part of that, you can go to youarethepower.net and sign up today.
Thanks. Other questions?
What do you think about hate speech laws in the United Kingdom, for example? And since I know that you think negatively of them, like, what is the appropriate response when there is such a powerful antagonism toward free speech in these countries? I mean, you know, what is the appropriate libertarian response to being able to get thrown in prison because somebody, you know, the government says you've been too hateful online?
Oh, well, first of all, that it's wrong, that it's patently absurd, that it's harmful, and that it will only serve the most powerful among us. You know, it's incredible to me that the newest iteration of what racism really means is power, bigotry plus power, or word I'm looking for, intolerance or prejudice plus power. So we're going to give the most powerful people in this country the ability to decide what you can and can't say. It's insane to me. So that would be the response. The response of how to deal with it, obviously besides advocating for ending it, each one of you has to individually decide how much good trouble you're willing to get in. But it is good trouble. If you are willing to be the martyr who faces prosecution and jail time for making even a mundane statement that's apparently not allowed, more power to you, and I will certainly stand in support of you. I also understand why you may not want to do that. It turns out most people don't want to go to prison or face economically crushing fines or losing their licenses or whatever. But I say that about all the rules. You have to, on everything, for lack of a other phrase, you have to decide whether you want to be judged by 12 or carried by 6. So I think that to some extent applies here. Are you willing to make that choice to resist? You have every moral and ethical reason to do so. Are you willing to allow that to potentially affect your life? That is a personal choice to make. I don't tell people go run into that minefield. I just tell them they have the right to do so.
How would you handle, or how do you think we should handle the issue of malicious, subversive foreign disinformation, especially in a media ecosystem where you have anonymous speech that may or may not be from an American, and that can cause a lot of harm to like American values and security and so on?
I think we should encourage critical thinking. There are very few countries where one could be more hypocritical than in this, where we say that we need to fight against foreign misinformation and interference into the thoughts of other countries, when we literally live in a country who I believe has the record for the number of foreign leaders we've just straight up knocked off, or engaged in color revolution campaigns using the CIA and whatever local terrorist groups they've created. So, as a side note, so much of the people that are migrating here, that frankly fleeing here from their home countries, are fleeing the political violence that was created by the intentional destabilization that was carried out by the CIA and in the Americas, the DEA, with cartels and terrorist organizations. They're the last people I trust to decide what is or is not misinformation, foreign or domestic. I think that the best way to deal with disinformation of any kind is to start thinking, and to encourage people to think, and to teach what that means. Thomas Sowell said the problem isn't that little Johnny's thinking the right or wrong thing, it's that he doesn't know how to think. And I think that we need to, critical thinking is probably the most important thing outside of, like, I don't know, ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, and it's probably right up there in importance that you could teach a child is how to actually to be able to consider ideas and to have some discernment behind it. We're not all going to be perfect thinkers, right? We all have our biases. We all have our emotions behind it. Might be having a bad day. Might eat something bad. Like we're not robots. We're not going to be able to just perfectly figure things out. And it turns out the robots are pretty biased too. It turns out. But I would say that the more, see, it's funny. But the more we can critically think, the more that shields us as individuals and us as a society from all the lies. Misinformation, disinformation, lies from the government, lies from your friend or neighbor. The more you're able to discern, the more that's going to serve you, and the more we individually and then as inherently as a collective are able to discern, the better off we all are. And I think that's the best way to deal with it. I do not trust central planning of deciding what is or is not true, much less what is or is not foreign, and as though that could potentially make it worse. And especially when that central planning will come from, in this country anyway, the biggest purveyors of misinformation, disinformation, foreign interference, destabilization, and so forth. Certainly one of the biggest.
Going the other way around, how about communication of state secrets or military intelligence in general, rather than specifically ones that put servicemen's lives at risk for example?
Yeah. So I would say that, so, I mean, the easiest thing to say is, I think Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, reality winner, I always say Chelsea Handler, but that's the comedian, Chelsea Manning, and the one who recently released the information about the drone strikes who's been prosecuted, who revealed that the US government knew that they were targeting an innocent Afghan family, but they needed bodies after the failed pullout. They needed to be able to say, we killed some terrorists after that, that fiasco. And so they basically killed people that were completely innocent, an entire family. And then when it was found out that they did, they said, yeah, no, that did happen. No one's going to be punished for it. We're not even going to demote anyone for it. I think that we should err on the side of the public knowing the truth. And I will say, I think generally speaking, Snowden and Assange and the others were at least careful to redact names and things like that so that there wasn't potential harm. I'm not going to claim that that was always the case or that I even believe, but I know for the most part, certainly with the WikiLeaks stuff, they took great pains to try to redact as much as possible to try to make sure that they weren't putting individual people's lives at risk. And again, I may be wrong on certain instances or so forth, but in general, I think the government should have little to no secrets, and I think that to whatever extent they are hiding things from us, I think that we should be more skeptical. We should feel more skeptical than safe as a result of that, I guess is the best way to put it. There's way more nuance to that, but that's the best rule of thumb here.
Any last questions?
Oh, sorry.
Two more extremes for you. Number that I'm trying to think of extremes. Blackmail and fake child porn.
Oh. Good ones.
Blackmail. That's a form of fraud. Right? It's a form.
Well, you're threatening to reveal something true.
So you know what? I'm going to say that I need to think about that before making an answer. I will say that if you are extorting someone, I generally think that that is a form of theft. But you have challenged me enough that I'm going to think twice on that. I will say with anything, and this, you know what? We may have found my thing that does not align with my, maybe not perfectly align with my perfect principle. I am against the death penalty. The existence of pedophiles challenges that. First offenders, even. As soon as you get into the question of seeking to harm, especially in that way, a child, or even simulate doing so, a lot of my strict libertarianism goes out the window, and I would let the chips fall where they may on that. I know the arguments for that being legal, that there wasn't a real child involved and so forth. I will let the courts determine that one, and I guess the legislators do. But I will say that as soon as I hear that that's happening, I could not care less what terrible things happen to the people involved in that, frankly. Maybe I'm not the perfect libertarian that I thought I was, but I literally could not care less what happens to them.
Is that a form of pragmatism?
It's a form of wanting to rid the world of, I think, one of its worst cancers. Yeah, that's where I fall on that. Again, I could say, well, maybe from the legal standpoint, they're taking the. I couldn't actually care less that.
Are you making a distinction between aggression and morality here, though?
Very possibly, I am, but that's my distinction. That's my line, guys. And I'll tell you, like, whenever anyone's like, "Oh, do you want to talk about the age of this?" No, I don't actually. I don't, because you may not like what I have to say about it. So that I may be making that distinction, and you'll have to put that on my gravestone. He wasn't perfect on his principle, because that would be the one. good questions, by the way, and I'm gonna think more about the blackmail one.
Last call.
Any other extremes? What about the simulated something?
All right.
Nothing? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.